you just have a bunch of parts of your brain working together, and the end result of that is this weird collection of things that you think of as conscious and others that you think of as unconscious and things that you think of as emotion and things that you think of as reason and like all these kinds of categories of thing, right? That are all being handled actually by kind of separate things that are shared with each other. And then we just call that. We call that yourself.
Being a brain is a team sport, you know?
Yeah, it really is.
Butterscotch Hey everybody, welcome to episode 424 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm suddenly realizing how big of a number that is.
It's a big one. It's a big one.
Jesus. What?
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot of episodes.
It's weird how most weeks I don't even know. I'm like, well, it doesn't even register. And then I'm like, what the hell?
What has been going on?
Yeah.
A lot. Well, I guess we could go back and listen and find out.
But it would take 424 hours to do.
It would take a minute. It would take some time. This is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. And today is Friday, July 14th, 20 Jubilee. Bearing in mind that, of course, Friday the 13th is an unlucky day, but the luck had to go somewhere. I assume it went to here.
Yeah, today.
Friday the 14th.
Yes.
So it's good. It's been a great day so far. Very lucky. Gonna maybe go buy a lottery ticket or
scratch ticket
or a cannoli vape, you know.
Yeah, you just roll your luck with those, you know.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to be in there.
That's right.
Could be a lizard.
Anyways, also, we have a warning there's going to be profanity in this show, and also thanks to our supporters at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Let's get into the real shit.
Get in there.
Okay, so I want to talk about game design today. My understanding is this is a game podcast kind of thing.
Sometimes it is.
So it's been a really interesting game design Pandora's box that has blossomed in the World of Warcraft community as of this past Tuesday. I want to talk about it. So the high level is that a new kind of character has been added to the game that has new capabilities that we've never seen before in the game. And it's throwing everything out of whack in the most hilarious of ways. Okay. So that's the hook. So let's talk about how this actually works. So in this game, there's essentially like three core kinds of player you can be. Okay, you can be a tank where you get hit by stuff. You
absorb
sort of
damage.
You absorb damage, and your primary job is positioning. You go around and you like get all the enemies to hit you, and then you try to group them together, corral them, and that allows your damage dealers, which is the next type of player, to come in and just beat the hell out of everything. Like the more enemies you get into a tighter pack, the easier it is to just blow them all up with big damage, okay? So the tank is a very important role. And the tank, if you don't have a good tank, it's hard to do good damage. Because if the enemies are scattered all around.
And also everyone just dies immediately. No one else can take hits.
Everybody just dies. Yeah, because there's other stuff, like some enemies do like a big frontal cone attack. And if the tank points them at the group,
not good,
instead of away from the group, that's bad. That's not good, right? So tanks have a big job, but and they're super important for your group's ability to defeat enemies. But it's kind of a thankless job because the damage dealers are the ones that have the big number. They're the ones that do big damage. And so damage dealers have this kind of reputation of being kind of self-absorbed about that fact and failing to recognize that it's a group effort. They're just like big number go up, and
they're like the CEOs of World of Warcraft, right? Where
basically, yeah.
Where really everything is like, I guess CEOs do a lot less than that. So maybe
that's true. CEOs do far less than your average World of Warcraft player, I would say. So all right. So you got your tank, you got your damage dealers, and then the third type of player is a healer. And as you'd expect, their job is to keep people alive. The tank's taking damage, healer heals them. Damage dealers will sometimes get hit by things. Damage dealers are also referred to as DPS, which is damage per second, which is just that's just an acronym for them. So healers keep people alive, DPS kill things, tanks round up the mobs and stay alive. So this is how the game has been forever. And just this past Tuesday, they added this new kind of a character class called the Augmentation Evoker, which is a incredibly long name. We'll just call it Augvokers for short. So the whole thing about an Augvoker is that they're a support class, which is a whole new thing, where they just buff other players. They just make you do more damage, or they make you take less damage, or they make you do more healing. And that fact isn't attributed to them. So
right, it's not visible anywhere. So you can't.
It's not visible.
Right. You can't see how much they're helping. You just know that in theory they are.
Yeah. And so there's kind of like these two ends of the spectrum that have appeared over the course of this week, which is that the community on the low end of performance, like the lesser skilled players, hate augmentation evokers. They hate having them in their group because an augmentation evoker, if they buff a bad player, the buff is essentially worthless.
Yep.
And the augmentation evoker can't really do much on their own. Like their whole thing is, I buff you. You are strong.
Yeah. So if you're playing with
you and
bad players, then you also wasted.
Then there's no point in having an augmentation evoker. And fully half of the player base is not good enough to warrant having one of these characters in their group. And they found, and like on the lower end, these players have found that whenever they bring an augmentation evoker, everything's way harder for them, right? So, but on the upper end, immediately all the best players in the world are like, oh my God, augmentation evoker is insanely overpowered. We have to have one. So every single one of the top end groups, of which there are like 1,000, they all have an augmentation evoker, because if you've got an incredibly good player and then you boost their damage by like 50 or 100%,
you couldn't make up for it.
It's a 2x incredibly good player, right? Like,
exactly.
No way to,
And so on the low end, it's being shunned, and on the high end,
it's required.
It's completely required, and the community perception about it is just so weird. Like, I've never seen a thing like this where like you've got a character that's terrible in the easy content and incredible in the hard content, which is purely just based on like team dynamics, Yeah.
Well, I think what's interesting to me about this is that you have the classic trifecta in a game. Like, well, you have this in like most RPGs and frankly most single player games too, which is you kind of choose your mode, right? Are you slow and tanky or fast and glass cannon, Yeah, it's the common way of balancing this stuff, right? You don't usually make something that's like super fast and murders everything, like sort of just easily. If you're trying to provide some interesting choice. And so what's interesting to me about it, as far as like their approach, is that WoW in particular is very much built up on, like all the content is built up on just the trifecta. And a big part of that is that the roles are clear enough that if you're a DPS or a healer or whatever else, if you're looking at your own numbers, while it's true that you're never capturing the full picture of what's happening, you're not missing a ton of information, right?
Yeah.
Well, people have gotten used to interpreting the nuances of those numbers over it.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but they've been used to
theory you could.
Yeah, in theory. So what's interesting about this is the inclusion of this class, which essentially is an invisible hand because of how data is tracked, how data is surfaced for other players, where you as a damage dealer cannot see the damage that you're doing because this person's present, nor can you as a tank see the damage that you're not taking because this person's present, etc. Yep. And so shipping this along with
that was a weird mistake that they
ability to see it. Yeah, it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's
visibility.
They actually the base game does not include any way to see how much damage you're doing. You have to do that through add-ons. So it's already the case that the players have tried to solve this problem on their own.
That's true. Yeah.
And there are, forthcoming updates to those add-ons to try to essentially take the extra damage that the evoker has given to other players and move that into that player's progress bar, basically, on their own damage meter.
Yep.
But then this has kind of opened up all kinds of, it's just a can of worms of conversations about this very thing, which is that there's tons of other classes that also bring some kind of
utility
buff. So like an easy example is like, as a monk, anything that I hit will just forever take 5% more physical damage. So if I've got physical damage dealers in my group, they just get 5% more damage. But that damage gets attributed to them, not to me, right? So all they know is, wow, my damage is great. I'm so good at video game, right? when really 5% of that, that's because I did. That's because I'm there. I didn't do anything special. I just was there.
Yeah. The point is that the numbers already have a lot of nuance inside them that already is not being taken into account. And it wasn't until this extreme form of this was introduced by this new character class that basically gets zeros for everything because there's no way to attribute it currently. But also has because you're talking like a 5% impact, right? But here for like your monk,
it's
stuff,
like
right?
100%.
But here it's like 100%. So not only is it, so now the fact that like to take the nuance that there is no nuance becomes such a problem because the interpretation of the results are dramatically skewed by the behavior of this other player versus like, because they still must be skewed as quite a bit by the group dynamics and all the weird stuff that everyone can do.
Yeah.
But yeah, so because it presumably is just already aligned. There's already too much of this whole like DPS imagining they're doing a lot better than they are because everybody else around them is really good. But to a tolerable degree, I guess.
It very much reminds me of that comic or meme of like the dude on the third place in the podium, like celebrating and spraying himself in the face with champagne, like thinking that he got first place when really like he's not even close, right? It's like you need a whole team of people to clear this content, and it's all like working in concert. But yeah, like you're saying, up until now, people have been able to kind of believe that they're an island, even though it's clearly not true. But like there was enough subtleties to it that you could kind of hand wave it. But then even more challenging is that there are like in some, like let's say this character comes in and it's just like, hey, whenever I push this button, you do 30% more damage for 10 seconds, right? Mm-hmm. That's just a flat fixed number, and it's very easy to reverse engineer
what
like how much damage I added to you, and then sort of like take that out and reattribute it back to me. Right. That's easy. But let's say you're a character that's like, oh, every time you get a critical hit, which is a random event, maybe you have like a 20% crit chance or something. Every time you get a critical hit, you gain, a 20% damage buff for 5 seconds. Right. And if I buff your chance to crit.
Yeah. You have to do
then what you don't know is if you get a crit, is it because of the extra bit that I gave you, or were you going to get that crit anyways?
Well, I mean, you have to do it probabilistically, right? So that if you double the chance to crit, then you would get half of the crit value.
In theory, yeah. And so there's all this like, and a lot of this kind of nuance has already been there. Like there's already been classes that like give crit buffs or haste buffs or whatever. And you've always had the damage dealers fighting over who gets those buffs because they want their own personal number to be bigger, right? And now it's just this huge can of worms where everybody's now questioning everything.
And, they should have been already, right? But now they just like really have
now
to.
It's way more obvious. And then there's a further kind of design problem that's come from this, which is that up until now, like because the different like character classes in the game were somewhat independent. Like they did buff each other like by 5% here or there or whatever. But it wasn't like if you have an augmentation evoker, now if you pair them with a mage, then like just because of the way the buffs work, the mage gets like triple benefit compared to everybody else.
Right.
And so now it's like, well, now you definitely want an augmentation evoker, but you also now have to have a mage. Right. And so then suddenly it's like because of the way the buffs work or don't work,
it ends up it ends up basically requiring multiple slots to be filled in a particular way.
Well, yeah, because it creates
highest level play.
Right, it creates positive feedback loops.
Yep.
But in the absence of those loops, then you get nothing, basically, right?
Yeah. And so now there's a problem, which is now mages are about to get nerfed. Not because they're good, but because evokers buff them so much, right? And so they're not nerfing evokers because evokers don't disproportionately affect everybody else. They only disproportionately benefit mages, which if mages become weaker, then that means now you always have to have an evoker
to make a mage
to bring them back up to right. So it's just like there's this whole thing where now everything is getting really constrained. So like all the top dungeon runs in the game from these past few days, every single one of them is the same 5 specs
of like what's 40 available?
5. Well, yeah, sorry. There's like 40-ish total.
Yeah.
Right. And then and this is 5-man group content, and all of the top runs now they look exactly the same. Because it's like
there is a best way to do it, basically.
There is a best way. Up until Monday of this week, there were lots of different ways you could do it. But now it's like, all right, bring whoever gets the biggest benefit from being augmented.
Yep.
And that's your group, right?
I think this is interesting because it's also we talk about games a lot as like you're basically creating a simulation of some imagined kind of reality, right? And then game development, game design is all about trying to figure out, okay, what happens then when we have this universe that we've created, when things interact, and like what incentives are we creating, and how do we measure what's going on, all that kind of stuff, right? How do we balance it? And all of this is just a dramatic, like the whole very complicated thing you described is a much infinitely simpler version of like any similar thing out in the world, right? And if you think about this as like, yeah, this is why we like issue KPIs and this kind of stuff, right? Because these are the same. You can think of a key performance indicator at a business as your DPS meter, right?
Your damage meter, yep.
Or literally any attempts to measure someone's performance.
You're
right?
talking about like during sprints, people talk about velocity.
Yep,
How many
during
cards
sprints?
did you move through?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
And or how many bugs did you clear? How many whatever,
Yep.
right? Because there's so much interdependence on a high performing team that you can't meaningfully disentangle like who did what, right?
Yes.
Well, as they say, isn't it like as soon as a measurement becomes a goal, it stops being a measurement.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, because now people start optimizing toward making that number big,
Yep.
regardless of the nuance of why it's big and how it could be bigger collectively.
Yeah,
you
that's
know,
why
like
it's
all
so
this
important to choose. So it's like GDP is the KPI our government uses to decide if the United States is doing a good job, right? But like GDP, if you optimize for that, you're optimizing for wealth disparity, actually, right? You're not actually optimizing for like quality of life of the average person, right?
Well, and weirdly, GDP is essentially how much shit did people buy
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
ultimately, and it's like, why is that the
Yep.
Why
But
is that
but
the
by people,
metric?
people includes companies and the whole thing, right? Like it's just how much money moved around. And since that's what we optimize for, then everything about our entire, system is aligned around, okay, well, make the money move more and in bigger amounts. And the easy way to do that is just to keep putting money on rich people, So like,
well, and also
this is a good model of
just keep adding people.
and just keep adding people,
growing the population.
because it's
and
also the
number go
KPI is
up.
about growth. It's not about like, oh yeah, it stayed flat. That's actually good, right?
It has to grow.
It has to grow, and
So, for some reason.
yeah, and so when every time you choose a KPI in a system of any level of complexity, that's basically always bad, right? But if you're going to do it, you have to then think through the nuances of, okay, what does this do, right? And I think
I think it's interesting because it's not necessarily that it's bad so much as I think that going into it not realizing that it creates incentives is that it's not just a measurement is sort of the, put it this way, it's extremely useful. It's like a deadline or any of these other things, right? Where it's like you could pick them arbitrarily, but they exert a tremendous amount of real world influence that can shape the nature of the work or the lives of the people who are like within that thing. But you still might need them in order to
but they can
like
be
have something to
useful
hold on
with
to.
nuance. But the thing is like,
Yeah.
because this is where you get into this discussion where I think people still fall into the trap too often of thinking that, well, having a number is better than not having any, right? Which
Right.
just is not true.
Always true.
That's
Yes.
just not true. Because you have to, if you can't fully work through the nuances of how to understand what that number means, what it means when it's big and small and whatever, right? Then you're better off not having it. It's just better to not have it. And I think
or it's better to have a bunch of numbers.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah,
try to
but
take
that's
them all
where the
to-
nuance comes from, right? Is from the other stuff. So I think the situation that sounds like Blizzard is in right now, or like WoW is in right now, is that the numbers that used to still have enough nuance that they were a problem, but actually still were meaningful without the nuance, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just not as meaningful as we would like, but still meaningful, have turned into things that actually are largely not meaningful now because the nuance is
So
too
big.
important and is too large actually, and it has a
It's no
large
longer
impact
nuance,
on those things.
right? It's actually
no longer
missing-
nuance. Yeah,
you're
it's just
missing a
right.
key
You're just
chunk.
misinformation.
Yeah, well, it was already the case. Like, it would drive me crazy when, because DPS players they have a reputation for being inappropriately competitive about their damage.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll take big risks to try to squeeze out one more ability cast, and then they'll do this weird thing where they'll be in a group with somebody on a team trying to do the same thing. They're both killing the same boss or whatever, they're working together. And when somebody else in their group starts doing more damage than them, they're upset about it. And there's all kinds of like running jokes. And in some cases, people will actually do it where like about sabotaging another player's ability to do damage so that your damage bar is bigger.
Yeah.
Right. As like it just there's no understanding of if we as a group are doing less damage, then everything is hard.
Well, I think a lot of this comes down
be.
to how even groups and things like that are structured or thought about in these contexts, right? Which is it's only at the highest level of play in a game like this where the group itself functions like a player, as in like a unified organism,
one unit
because it lives for a long time. You're not just doing a run and then just 5 other random people, each time. Yeah. And so it's only when you have
you learn as a group.
You basically have a band, right? Yeah. It's like you have a band or a team from like a basketball league or something. It's not just random stuff. It's kind of like when you see in like pickup games of say soccer or basketball or whatever else. Like the reality is that most people, while it's fun on the team aspect, you'll see oftentimes there'll be at least a person who is very intense about their own performance being just awesome. Even if I played kickball in St. Louis and there's this guy on our team who would not change his method for kicking the ball because he just wanted to kick it as far as he could. Right. And it was like
just far. That's his KPI.
Yeah. Most fully grown adults playing kickball who are in the outfield will catch any goddamn thing you kick their way. So you got to.
It's big. It's a big red ball, right?
But like 1 out of every 10 times he did it, they'd miss. And then he'd do a full lap. They'd be like, oh my God, so cool.
Yeah,
right?
I am a god before my kickball skills.
The other 9 times, guaranteed strikeout, right? And so it's one of those things where like he's playing, again, maximizing a different set of parameters than everybody else. And so there's no, if you're not able to live long enough as a group, or as a team, people moving around, whatever else, then your incentive to see that bigger picture and recognize that it's like, oh yeah, it's this overall group damage. It's this overall capacity for the team to do, make a video game or whatever else. It just kind of gets eroded and you just start kind of looking out for your own enjoyment in something, which isn't necessarily a bad thing depending on the context, because there might not be anybody looking out for the broader, there might not be any incentives.
I think it is a bad thing in any team context. Mm-hmm. Like if you are just not at all optimizing for the group's success and you've just picked some personal metric with no regard for what that actually means for the team's ability to accomplish its goals.
I agree if it's the case that the team is trying to function as a team. I think the challenge is like we were talking about this so many times, you're talking about it in like in a corporate environment or in a even like casual environment where the whole thing is just not functioning as a team, if that makes sense. Like,
but it's supposed to be, though, it's supposed to be. Yeah. And the problem is that each one of these things, like each KPI that is goes against the idea of people working as a team, or at least just is decoupled from that, right? Further actually drives the team away from team behavior, right? Yeah. So if you have like, so even like in World of Warcraft, if you have it so that, there's a bar for how much healing you did, right? And there's a bar for how much damage you did, and there's a bar for how much damage you took, and those are the 3 things, right? Then if that's all the information that you have, then everyone's goal, like all they can like look at is basically like, okay, well, I'm responsible for that number, so I need to make that number as big as possible, right? Well, the fact is, it doesn't matter how big that number is, right? And like a person taking damage, like ideally they would still cluster everybody up without actually taking any damage, right? Like ideally, right?
They keep ideally alive.
A damage dealer would just time the damage really well so that the amount they did was less important than when they did it, right? Mm-hmm. And there's enough nuance all the time with all of these things that the moment you just use these dead simple metrics to try to understand something, you actually drive. You make team-based work impossible.
Yeah. And I say this to my teammates all the time, where like if my healing numbers are big, we have a problem and we need to figure that out.
Yeah, because that means people are taking too much damage. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I don't want my number to be big. I want it to be I want it to be 0%. I don't want to ever have to save anybody, even though that's my job, right? But like, the more damage people take, that means we're making a lot of mistakes.
Yeah. And with your damage dealers, what you also want is that you want everybody to be really good so that also like you can manage if somebody's gone or whatever, right? Which means what you want is to have everybody have similarly very large numbers, right? You want a minimum discrepancy between the lowest number and the biggest number, right? And so again, like but you can't optimize for that, right?
Yeah. Well, weirdly though, now like because of these augmentation of ogres, because of mages, and then like priests also have an external buff that they can give to somebody. So now every group comp is no longer about maximizing like overall damage. It's just make the mage do as much damage as possible.
Yep.
So everybody just buffs the mage.
Well, that becomes the team
mage
dynamic, actually, right? Is that
Yeah,
It can be, yeah.
yeah, and so it's
and in
it's
that case,
pretty
you might
interesting.
understand if everyone like understand again. This is where the nuance comes in, right? If people in that context understand, okay, our goal as a team is to all of us drive this number up,
Right.
Just one
Turn
specific
this
number.
person into a demigod for as long as possible.
And then as long as everybody knows that that's what we're doing, and so they understand like what that number means, which is not, oh, this person is really good. Look how big their number was. It
means our team.
look how good our team is
Yeah.
because we were able to work together to make that number as big as possible, right?
Yeah, well, that's why you can't at the very high end. You don't have players with those egos, because like if the mage player was flaunting and like throwing in everybody's face about how great their damage was, when really like that's the whole point. Like that's the whole strategy is like make that person's damage big. If they were shit talking everybody in their group,
Yeah, it's so weird, right?
Which again, back to the
Then-
metaphor
then
of like being in a company with a bad manager, right? Of like the manager taking credit for all the things that go well, and then it's somehow everybody else's fault when things don't, and the whole thing. Like it's just the same dynamics.
It's fascinating.
yeah. So it's been interesting to kind of like watch the community like grapple with this, and it's also been very, in my opinion, very sort of shaded and Freud satisfying to watch players who have been playing as damage
Quote,
dealers,
DPS, yeah.
and then they switch to this new support character, and then they say things that are so obvious, but it's like a whole new revelation for them, where they say things like, "Wow, when one of my teammates dies, it makes things really hard." Because it's like they're like, I have one less person to buff,
Yeah.
and I'm like, that's always been true. It's always been true that when one of your teammates dies,
It's
things
bad.
get harder.
It was just that
You
they were
just
the one
didn't give a
dying
shit.
because they were taking risks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, either you were the one dying or you just didn't give enough of a shit because all you were looking at was your own number and make big number bigger. You know? And in many cases, like I would see, like I was talking about earlier, like a damage dealer would die and then the other damage dealers would start to celebrate because now they can make their number get much bigger than that person's, right? And I'm like, what are you doing? This is a group effort.
It's weird that that groups, I guess, are these like guilds where this is happening, or is this like random groups? Because it would be bizarre to me to have a guild where you intentionally have people who have grouped themselves together on purpose, and then that behavior is allowed to exist.
It happens.
level.
It happens in every group except for essentially like the top 1% of
I guess it
players.
is like it's the way that all human organizations work, isn't it? So
It's very ego driven, right? And like only once you give up on that and just start thinking about how do we collectively meet our goals, that you see people actually start to excel as a team and stop like sabotaging each other or shit talking each other or being mad because somebody else outdamaged you and then like Alt F4 quitting the game for a couple days because you're pissed off that your group did well, but not because of you explicitly. I don't know, like the whole thing is
it's just
So it's- I don't know,
such
it's-
horrible behavior.
I think it's a cool and interesting change, to like introduce something like this, just because of all of this nuance. But it's going to be a very turbulent, remainder of the season while all these kinks get worked out.
Well, and I think there's also an important takeaway here, which is because like art reflects life, and video games are just little universes that we make that in order to play they have to somehow map onto the real world so you can understand what's happening.
Yep.
I think this is one of those things when you're making a social game, where if you don't design it so that it already just tries to enforce good team building and team behavior,
Try to bend those incentives.
right, then all you're going to do is replicate the average team-based behavior just of people, right? Which is because we aren't trained how to be good teammates, actually, like most of us in most contexts. And so the net effect then is you actually exacerbate these problems. Whereas if you, and like you said, like the really high performers, like the reason they're so high performing is because they have worked their way out of that bad behavior to actually operate.
They
as a team, right?
zoom out.
Yeah,
They're not thinking
this
about
is the
themselves.
same it's the same in sports, it's the same in companies, it's the same in any relationship.
Same in the
dynamic, right?
studio. You know, it's like
Yeah, exactly.
I used to be like, look how much art I'm making. La 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 la. And meanwhile, Seth's just like,
Just
I'm
drown
dying.
in art.
Can you stop?
Could you fuck that? And I'm like, no, look how
this is,
fast
you
I'm
know,
going.
People talk about like the problem of the 10x developer. You know, it's the programmer who comes in and they're like, I can fucking code anything by myself from scratch. I'm gonna move all the Kanban boards. I can do anything, and then they're very confident, and it's very exciting for the manager to see this one person appear to be outputting the workload of like 5 or 10 programmers.
And then what you
But
need
then-
though is those 5 or 10 programmers to be cleaning up behind them the whole time. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it actually does take 10 programmers to handle the messes that person's making. And then when that person leaves, you know, why are they putting out code so fast? It's because they're not writing tests, they're not writing documentation.
They're not
doing anything.
working as a team. They're not teaching people, they're not helping people through stuff, right? It's just all them somehow.
Yeah. So then of course when they leave or when they're unavailable, then all hell breaks loose. And like in the Phoenix project, the book we always talk about for DevOps, it was like what Brett or whatever. Yeah, like there's this one guy in their IT department who knows everything and is involved in everything. That's their 10x developer, and they literally can't function as a company because of this person. It's not that they can't function without him. It's that they can't do anything because this person is the linchpin to too many things and they can't do it. Right. So yeah, it's like
It's all the same. You always see these little echoes of this stuff, right?
yeah, it's all fractal.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, but I think part of the frustration I have when I see these multiplayer games, it's like see the just toxic as fuck social dynamics that are built in all of these, is that because the game world is something you actually control as a designer, right? Like it's really hard to predict all the possible outcomes and to do it, make it, you know, happen exactly the way you want to. That's certainly true, right? But you do get to control that whole fucking universe though, which means if you wanted to optimize for trying to cause players to work better together and like learn how to cooperate and all that kind of stuff, you could prioritize that in your design. And the end result, like take the 10 million people, whatever, who play World of Warcraft regularly, right? Now take the fact that, Seth, you're like, oh yeah, 90 or 99% of teams like are made up of this really horrible dynamic, right? Now imagine if 90% of them were made of the good dynamic instead, because the game helped to create that. And now those 10 million people go out into the world, into their workplaces and their homes, and like,
And they're starting to carry those lessons with
and they
them.
carry those lessons with them, and the
How could
whole
this feel
world
like
gets
my
better.
web team? Yeah.
Yeah. Because like we do this with the studio, where we bring stuff from the studio into our regular lives and back, right? As we find better ways of managing interpersonal dynamics and how to like just think about problem solving and how to solve our own stuff, right? We just keep moving that back and forth between all the different environments we use. And like Seth, I'm without a doubt, and I've heard from you talking about stuff, like you take the stuff from the studio back into the guild and vice versa, right? Like all this stuff
100%.
transfers everywhere. And so it's the thing that drives me the most crazy about these like big AAA competitive team-based video games is that for some fucking reason during the whole like design process, they just acted like people don't have social dynamics.
They're behaving like economists.
Yeah, they're
who
behaving
are
like economists. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
And-
as we know, every person is a rational utility maximizer with perfect information. It's like, that's not anything. That's not a thing.
Yeah, you just have to, and it has to work that way. I know there's a lot of discussion on Blue Sky right now, one of the Twitter competitors, right? Because the fucking dummies who are running it were like, well, this is just like, this is our test bed for this like technology we're developing, right? But they've opened it to the public, right? So like it's got, I don't know, 100,000 users on it or
A
something.
test bed that's with like a beta or dev servers.
Yeah, but now, of course, now the Nazis are showing up, right? And there was a big hullabaloo because there was a user who put the N-word in their username, and apparently they didn't have a check for that in the back end, right? So like, and their response is just like, well, this is just a test bed, you know? And they're like, we just haven't like identified all the places where we need to work on moderation stuff. And I'm like, I was thinking back to us doing Levelhead.
Yeah, that's not an edge case, man. That's
For the moment we designed anything, every single thing, we were like, if a user can choose to do something, someone will weaponize it. So how do we make it so that they either can't or we minimize the impact of that? And we did that for every design decision. And minimize the incentives, yeah. And did that for every design decision, every single one, right? And then you see, and we're making just a fun video game that's barely even competitive. You don't, right? Like, And then other
Yeah,
people are out
single
here
player.
building
Yeah.
social networks, or they're building
Yeah, the
multiplayer
stakes are
games where
low
you shoot
is
each other.
for us.
Yeah, exactly. And we're like,
Yeah,
and we understand though that like people will weaponize literally anything, and you have to design the thing to actually cause them to work together and collaboratively and to celebrate each other's wins. And you could design for that. You can absolutely
you need to
design to
understand-
incentivize that.
Yeah, you need to understand people. You need to understand group dynamics, and like you
Yeah.
need to understand like how individually people think and are motivated. But you also need to think about group dynamics and how individual motivations can potentially undermine group dynamics and you know, all that stuff. And like you're saying about Nazis, right? Like you got to recognize there's this fucking rule on the internet, which is you know how like if you leave any like sugary thing out, you just get ants.
Yep.
Right? It's like if you leave an unmoderated community, you get Nazis. They just come in. They're just like, I just detect my Nazi senses are tingling. I've detected a place where I can go shit on people, right? And they show up in droves, and you can't budge an inch on moderation or any of that stuff.
Has to be
as soon as you
out of the
do,
gate.
they come in with a crowbar and they pry that inch open into a mile-wide gulf, you know? So, So anyways, it's been,
just,
you know,
drives me nuts.
I'll bring in some updates about like how all this, if anything interesting kind of changes with it. But I think it's just kind of a, just an interesting design moment in history.
Yeah.
You know? So, now, I also want to talk about the ChatGPT code interpreter, which Sam, you had some, Adam, you guys had some experiences with this week.
Well, I just want to mention because we've talked a bit about ChatGPT, about some use cases for it that we've had in house, largely around little bits of code, maybe basically a combo partner for marketing messaging, kind of that sort of stuff. They recently launched, if you're a subscriber, which costs $20 a month, a additional feature called Code Interpreter. And what that does is it basically gives ChatGPT right out of the box the ability to write and execute its own code. And
gives you the ability to upload files for it to use.
Yeah. And so with that combination, then you can do stuff like, take a CSV or a spreadsheet file, for example, that you maybe normally would have put into Excel, done a bunch of work to analyze whatever else. And you can just give it ChatGPT and be like, hey, make me a graph of this. And even if that's all you say, it'll be like, I don't know exactly what you mean, but here's like a good idea of what I could do based on the structure of this data. And here's what it looks like. Also, I animated it into a GIF. Go, impress people. And you're like, okay, thanks, buddy. And it's fucking ridiculous. Yeah,
it's fast.
It's very fast.
And because it's writing code, because it's basically writing and running code on some server behind the scenes, right? Just writing Python specifically, and it'll show you the code it wrote, which is cool because then you can like take and adapt it if you need to, or if you have if you're doing a test data set and having it help you figure out how to like analyze it and generate plots and stuff, then you can just literally take the code that it wrote and then bring that over to your own system, right? But like the main value is it removed the size barrier that was there previously. Well, besides just like also giving you much more interesting outputs with like graphs and stuff, right? Yeah. But because it removed that barrier, because now it doesn't have to ChatGPT itself doesn't have to read the whole file you upload, right? It just has to read enough of it to know what the patterns are. Mm-hmm. And then it can write a small program to then operate on that whole file. And so that it doesn't actually have to hold all this stuff in its memory because it can't. It has a very strict memory limitation, right? And so this is a way around it.
So what I found is super useful then is there's a lot of stuff that we have to do in the studio, or even if you're just a regular person doing stuff, where you got to take data that multiple companies give you, or even the same company but in different formats, and you got to do something with it, right? We've talked a lot about how one of ChatGPT's main powers is just transformation of data, transformation of language, transformation of, I don't know, a recipe into a rap. It's the same thing.
It's in the name, that's what the T stands for. It's transformer.
That's true. There you go. So the nice thing about this is that there's some data that we've always had access to technically in that it exists.
It's a pain in the ass though.
Yeah, but it's a pain in the ass to merge it all together. And the best example, if you're a game dev out there, a fun use case for this to just play with it, is that Steam does this really weird, dumb thing where they provide you the total traffic that is coming to your store page, right?
That's not the dumb thing. That's cool.
It's kind of cool, except for the fact that when you download it, it's not given to you by date. It's instead only given to you bucketed by the category of traffic. So where was this coming from? Was it direct traffic? Was it on the Steam front page?
And I think the way that I would generally summarize Steam's the data they give to you is that they have fuckloads of really interesting data, but the only way you can get it is by looking at the things that they have curated to present to you, right?
Yes.
And you can't just, so if you have questions that aren't addressed that are addressed potentially by the data, but not by how they're showing it to you or like how they're mixing it together, you can't get those answers a lot of the time.
Very
Actually.
hard.
Yep.
Yeah. And even like things that should be simple, which is like blending, for example, how much traffic did I get onto my store page on this day with how many wish lists or how many purchases did I get also on that day? Can I see those two things together? No, I cannot. You can see them separately, and in fact, in like 3 separate places and all sorts of stuff like that. And so there's been, we want to be able to actually put some data together so you can see the effects of some of these events, some of these sales that we're doing, whatever else, or just frankly, just to have a clearer picture of what the fuck is happening without having to look across like 4 different tabs, right? And
they also all load slowly.
You don't want to spend 4 hours just to get the answer to a question that you have every week.
Yeah, exactly. And so using GPT and the code interpreter, then I basically pulled down the CSVs that were available from Steam, found the issues with ChatGPT, recommended ways to fix those issues, including using a computer vision tool that I've never even heard of to just give it a picture of that nice chart that it shows you of your traffic over time, which is data it does not give you, but it shows you as a graph, and actually reverse extrapolate it out of the picture using OCR. I didn't know that's even possible. So it lets you do, basically ChatGPT was like, hey, do all these things and give me all that data and we'll kind of figure it out. And then it did the data cleaning. And then if I could output this beautiful graph that had like event markers and everything else on it, that was so much more comprehensive than anything I've been able to do so far. And then, just wasn't like a huge pain in the ass to do. You know what I mean? Like
it's still a little tedious, but it's not. So the one that I used it for was simpler in some ways, but it's just like tedious stuff, right? Which was that I needed to convert some documentation from GameMaker into code, right? And so they had a whole bunch of HTML tables on the site. And so I needed those as data. And then I needed to convert that data into something that was programmery, And so I was looking at that and I was like, and it's just a whole bunch of like disparate, separate tables. And I'm like, okay, what is the way that doesn't suck to do this, right? And historically, what I would have done in that scenario is like, just download the HTML and then write a script to like parse it and convert it. Because
that's like a whole afternoon project.
Well, yeah, for me, I'm familiar enough with the tech. It's like, half an hour, right? But still like it's a bunch of really tedious stuff and a lot of trial and error because things are not usually well crafted on the internet and stuff, or I would try to like copy paste it just like raw out and then see if I could convert the spacing into a tab separated tape, or whatever. But anyway, it ends up being this kind of just horrible process, right? And so then this time I was just like, okay, cool. Let me go. So I found a tool that I could use to just export the tables individually from HTML to CSV files. And then I just uploaded all of them and told ChatGPT, hey, I want these CSVs in this JavaScript data structure format. And it just spat them right out. That was it. End of the story. And I've been finding this too because there's also a CoPy, which we talked about a bit, is GitHub's toolkit that's built on top of the OpenAI stuff that they make ChatGPT and all that. And they now have this like little sidebar widget that is like a chat built right into your code editor. And similarly now, I'll just select some stuff and just be like, hey, convert this into blah. Because this is kind of similar because it also can see your code, right? Same kind of idea. And all this stuff that used to be this like really tedious find and replace where I've like, there's a particular skill I learned and honed over the years of using regexes, regular expressions, which are like a weird little mini coding language that you can use to find patterns in text, right? And I've gotten really good at those things because that's been my go-to solution to like solve these kinds of really annoying transformation problems. And now all of a sudden I just get to write in plain ass English, hey, do this. And now because of this ChatGPT plugin, you can kind of do it at any scale. Right.
Yeah.
Which is wild.
Well, I almost wonder. So there was an announcement about a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago. There was a white paper released by Microsoft about expanding the context window for ChatGPT to 1 billion tokens. So what that means
is something like 4 gigabytes of text data.
Yeah. So a token is just like a collection of characters. Usually, I think it's about 4 characters. You can just think about it as a word. It's almost interchangeable with words. So So like as you're talking to ChatGPT and the conversation gets longer, or if you pasted a big thing in there or whatever, while it's composing its response, it is only able to look back 8,000 tokens in the conversation. So something you'll notice is, like I noticed this when I was trying to have ChatGPT be a dungeon master for a D&D campaign. At the very beginning, it's like, fuck yeah, let's go. And it's like really good at being a DM. But once you get past the threshold where the conversation's been going on long enough that your initial instructions explaining to it, hey, you're a dungeon master, blah, blah, blah. Once it loses that context, then it just kind of defaults into its normal mode and it just becomes like a generic storyteller and stops being a DM.
It forgets its purpose.
It forgets, it forgets things, right? And so the context window has kind of been like one of the biggest problems with LLMs, with large language models right now that people have been trying to solve.
And the way that they do solve it currently, until this like widening the window somehow, has been adding in lots of layers of creative ways to reintroduce stuff. And so it's like in Copilot in your code editor, every time I was trying to give you autocomplete suggestions and stuff, it'll basically like re-look at the tabs that you have open and the most recent code that you wrote and whatever, right? So basically it tries to like focus in on the likely most relevant. And so basically people have to go through and like work out all this logic of, okay, how do we go get the likely most relevant context information to feed into this highly constrained system? Yeah. And that part is still then really difficult and expensive and time consuming for people to figure out.
Yeah, and so this 1 billion token context window breakthrough is really cool, and this is one of those things that keeps happening in the same way that keeps happening over and over again, where people are working on these large language models, and then they're like, well, how do people do it? Mm-hmm. And then they just figure out a way to replicate that in the LLM, and then it turns out it just works. So in the case of this context window thing, the best analogy I've seen is if you, let's say you're like standing outside and you're looking at this vista and you're looking out across this view and you can see mountains and like a river and like a little town, on the side of the river. And like you can see tons of things. You can see millions of things technically, right? In your field of view, individual trees and boats and whatever. But what does your brain do when that happens? Your brain doesn't try to look through and catalog every single one of the million little things that you're seeing. Your brain,
the raw data is basically just the light intensity on each of the light receptors in your eyeball, right? And like that's not what you're not looking at that.
Yeah, there's
you're not looking at millions of things.
A tremendous amount of top-down processing going on for every single one of your senses.
So there's this kind of like high-level categorization where your brain basically is like, oh, this is a nice view, right? You're thinking of it as like a landscape view. It's just one thing that you're looking at. And then at different points, you can be like, you can focus your eyeballs and look at a boat, right? And you're like, oh, that's an interesting boat. And you haven't forgotten that the boat is part of the landscape or like where it is in the river or any of that stuff. But you're able to kind of like keep the context, the broader context of overall what it is you're looking at while still honing in on specific details. And you're able to then kind of like catalog all the little details of a thing and keep that in context, right? So it's kind of like this zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out kind of thing. And so this is the paradigm shift that they're doing with this like 1 billion token thing is there's multiple layers to the model where it's able to kind of create a high level sort of fuzzier view of the kinds of things that it's looking at in like a giant document or a huge code base or whatever. And then it's able to use that as a starting point to figure out where to zoom in.
Which is basically like what I describe as like what people are currently doing is like they're doing the work of saying, okay, with this bigger context.
They're programming that by hand.
Yeah, how do we programmatically boil this down? And now that means you have to work out all the very specific details of how to make that happen.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to see what it looks like when they...
Well, what I'm wondering is like, is the code interpreter even necessary once you have this? Because like the whole reason you've got the code interpreter and why it needs to write code behind the scenes is because of the context problem. If you have a big file or a big code base or whatever, and you're like, I need you to look at all this data and like give me a list of these things. Well, if it can only hold on to 8,000 things at a time and your file is already way bigger than that, then its brain just isn't big enough to to zoom in and figure out where to look. So instead, it's writing, just like we do, it's writing code to make it so that the cognitive load is lower to do, like, because you, Adam, you could have just line by line gone through that website and copy pasted everything off of it. Or Sam, you could have gone through Steam and like taken a ruler to those graphs and try to figure out what the values are. And you could have done that in 3 days, right? But instead we rely on code to reduce the cognitive load. Well, if your brain is so fucking big and strong that cognitive load is essentially a meaningless concept, then you don't have to write any code at all.
What do you mean you can't hold an entire database of a billion things in your mind?
Yeah, if you could just look at a thing and just instantly be like, and instantly answer and analyze and solve any set of questions about it and create visualizations or whatever and get all the nuance, you would never write code at all, right? Like you just wouldn't have to do that. And so I almost wonder if the code interpreter thing, powerful as it is actually just an intermediate step to augment the brain of the
I think it
LLM,
is, but not until the LLM is much more capable. Because even if once it can handle more volume, it still can't handle things like building a graph, right? Like of exactly lining up data into some kind of a graphical format is like something that is, in principle, something that understands how to generate images and something that understands how to process natural language. Could do, right? But currently we don't have any models that are able to do both of those things at the same time. But, ChatGPT, because there are image generation models, right? We've seen a whole bunch of those.
Yep.
And so it could be that it offloads to another AI. But at the moment, all the image generating AIs I've seen heavily rely on the fact that images are really lossy in the sense of they can convey something with a large error rate and still successfully, because they don't need to convey something exactly, right?
Yeah,
and they still successfully convey the idea. And they can convey something really cool, but if you ask any of the current models that I've seen anyway, if you ask them to do something really specific, they can't do it. And if you ask them to like create a graph, like I haven't seen anything. I haven't even seen anything that could put words on stuff, although that may have changed recently. But like literally can't even put text on.
They're getting closer and closer. Like every week I see a new image from like Stable Diffusion or something where it's like most of a word is there now, and like all the hands look correct.
But I think Adam's point though, it's like using code in general to do things is just super. It's a tool. It's basically the AI. If you think about it as a big person brain, is able to also leverage things in a way that a big person brain is not very good at. So it is very hard to do precise image generation of graphs, for example, unless you're using something like some code. You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't you'd still probably want to do that. And then even beyond that, the reality is still that it probably will be the case that there are just a billion tools that you still want to use.
And there are if you think about it too, about an efficiency standpoint, right? Like if you're trying to use a natural language model to say like sum up 1 million columns on a CSV file, right? Like that's an extremely inefficient way to try to solve that problem versus having that same model say, "Ooh, I need to sum these things up. Let me go quickly write a script and get the sum instead," right? And so I think what we're going to see is not that something like ChatGPT or that the language model becomes able to do these things. I think what we're going to see is that we get more and more of these general purpose, but still very specifically focused tools that are, because like a language model and like an image model, like those aren't the same, like those aren't even related to each other, like how that stuff has to work, right? And so it doesn't even make sense to try to like make a language model that can also make images, right?
Well, I think about it more like,
but I think they'll just hand work off to each other. I think is what we're going to start seeing.
Yeah. Well, the stated goal of OpenAI is to make AGI, artificial general intelligence, right? So like an intelligence that can do all of the things that a human.
Man, I'm telling you, if you upload a fucking CSV into this thing and see it try to figure out what's happening with the data,
it's uncanny.
It is very.
It's what you would do.
It's exactly what you would do. And it's like, oh, sorry, I ran this code and it looks like this header is a little bit different than I thought. So I'm going to analyze this other part of the document, write this new piece of code.
Because it's also it's reading the error messages that come out, right? And again, the same way Yeah.
It's very spooky.
Yeah, but my assumption is that sort of like what we're seeing right now is it's kind of like it's hard to find it's hard to find an analogy because like as humans like we have the brain that we have and there's no point
But
where
it's
like,
also
suddenly your brain just becomes really good at math. Like you've got to work at that. Right?
Yeah, but I think
like,
but there's a misconception that people have that like our brain is one thing, right?
Yes.
And
that's what I was. Yeah.
but it's actually a whole bunch of modules that are really good at something and really bad at literally everything else. And then mechanisms for them to communicate with each other and like sort of abstract information in a way that other parts can actually understand and do stuff with, right? And so if we do end up with like a general intelligence sort of a thing, it's going to be the same sort of imaginary construct that our own like your own self is also something you imagine exists, right? Because you just have a bunch of parts of your brain working together, and the end result of that is this weird collection of things that you think of as conscious and others that you think of as unconscious and things that you think of as emotion and things that you think of as reason and like all these kinds of categories of thing, right? That are all being handled actually by kind of separate things that are shared with each other. And then we just call we call that yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
you're saying being a brain is a team sport.
Exactly.
You know,
that's exactly what
it
just tie it all
is.
back together. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
really
all
true.
no one part of your brain is you, and no one part of your brain is useful in all contexts.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
the
So
whole
what
thing
we're going to
together.
see is stuff like, and I think we're already seeing this is people trying to figure out how to stitch these things together, right? But what we'll be seeing is like these general purpose tools and all the tools that we see people building right now on top of the existing various kinds of models are just different ways to connect these and bring them together in the same way that we use our own brains to do that, right? And so I don't think the idea of like a general purpose intelligence, I don't think that even makes sense, honestly. I think that's one of those things.
Well, I think it does if you become less rigid in your definition.
That's what I mean.
Because
That's what I mean. Like definitionally, I don't think it's a thing. I think a general purpose intelligence just means it can handle a wide variety of kinds of problems, right?
Well, I'd say it's a thing in the same way that a video game is a thing, right?
Or a
really
person.
like
Yeah, sorry. I mean, it's not a singular thing. There's not like the concept of like of a general purpose intelligence isn't like, oh, well, we're going to like make that and then we did it now, right? In the same way that
it ultimately will be one thing, but it's going to be made up of lots and lots of.
But when you say it, you
composite.
mean they will be each, but they will each be one thing.
Right.
That's what I'm
I mean,
saying.
they in
It's
the
like-
same way that like you are a plural, made up of lots of parts of brain and body.
No, I mean they in the sense of you, like the three of us are individual general intelligences, right? There's no such thing as like a human intelligence, right?
Right.
In the same,
correct.
And in the same sense, there's like, there's not going to be a general intelligence. It's not that we're all racing it. Someone's going to finally make the general intelligence and now all of our problems are solved, right? It's going to be that people
There will be a
model
bunch of
different
different ones.
subsets of generally applicable problem solving by combining these things together, coming up with new ways to do these things. And we're going to end up with a new ecosystem and I think like sci-fi has done a really good job of this, of like forecasting out these different kinds of AIs of like of different levels of capability, right? And like approach and like some going up to like what we would then call a self-aware, all the way down to like a fairly single purpose, the robot who just gives you butter pads.
What's my purpose?
but for some reason is sentient.
But it's for some reason, because like you could.
That was an unnecessary addition
Well,
to
it helps. It really helps that serve the butter better. That's our KPI, right? So
Yep.
It does. I mean, it's way easier to tell a robot that, is an AGI, tell it to pass the butter, and you don't have to give it any more instructions than that, and it can figure stuff out. But problem is, it's also depressed.
yeah, is it being sort of tortured spiritually the entire time? Maybe, but hey, KPIs,
course.
baby. I just need the butter delivered.
KPIs. All right. Well, we live in interesting times.
Certainly fucking do. I tell you what.
And as a little final cliffhanger, there's going to be congressional hearings about aliens at the end of this month.
Jesus.
So
What is happening?
There's just a lot
talk-
going on.
we'll talk about that later.
2020
I've been following
didn't bring
it.
us flying cars, but it did bring us end-stage capitalism, artificial intelligence,
And aliens.
and aliens. So and a global pandemic. It's a bit of a mixed bag, as far as that goes.
Truly.
Yeah.
And
These past 4 years have been a long decade. 4? 3? What the fuck?
yeah, man.
Oh. All right. Well, anyways, that's all the time we have for this
that's
week.
good.
We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. And of course, as always, if you haven't yet, head over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list, because it'll help get exposure for the game and boost it in the algorithms and all that good stuff. And we appreciate it tremendously. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.